The year was 1976. Washington, D.C. was breathing a strained sigh, caught between the lingering paranoia of Watergate and the fragile optimism of détente. The city's mood was reflected in its architecture, brutalist concrete structures of the federal government offset by the fading elegance of Georgetown. It was a city of hierarchies, where proximity to power was the only meaningful currency, and yet, most of its inhabitants were merely cogs in the vast bureaucratic machine. The air was thick with the humidity of the Potomac and the unspoken tension of the Cold War, a conflict fought not in trenches, but in whispered conversations, stolen documents, and compromised lives. Eleanor Vance was one of these cogs. At 27, she inhabited a modest apartment in Arlington, Virginia, distinguished only by its beige carpets and proximity to the metro. Her life was a study in routine. She was a GS9 analyst in the Department of Commerce, specifically within the Office of Export Administration, OEA. It was considered a bureaucratic backwater, a place for those who lacked the sharp elbows required for the State Department or the cold precision of the intelligence community. The OEA's mandate was deceptively dull. It processed and approved licenses for the export of American technology to foreign nations, including those in the Eastern Bloc. Eleanor spent her days reviewing applications for mainframe computers, integrated circuits, and advanced machine tools, cross-referencing their technical specifications against federal watch lists. It was tedious work, defined by carbon copies and the hum of IBM typewriters. Eleanor was intelligent but constitutionally quiet. She felt overshadowed by the ambitious, fast-talking men who dominated her division. She was overlooked, and she knew it. This sense of invisibility cultivated a private loneliness, a vulnerability shielded by a competent but unremarkable professional exterior. She desired significance, a feeling that her meticulous work mattered, yet she remained trapped in a cycle of processing forms that disappeared into the federal ether. Into this carefully ordered, sterile environment came Dmitry Volkov. He arrived in Washington not with a bang, but with a whisper. His legend, the crafted backstory created by the KGB's first chief directorate, PGU, was a masterpiece of plausibility. He was presented as a Soviet dissident, a mid-level academic from Leningrad State University, specializing in econometric modeling. His defection, supposedly orchestrated through Vienna 6 months prior, was attributed to his quiet critiques of the Brezhnev-era economic stagnation. He was granted political asylum and settled in the D.C. area, ostensibly surviving on translation work and a small stipend from a refugee assistance organization. Dmitry was not conventionally handsome. His power lay in his stillness. He had watchful, empathetic eyes and a talent for listening that made people feel truly seen. He frequented the city's intellectual haunts, lectures at George Washington University, the dusty aisles of secondhand bookstores, and dimly lit chess clubs. He projected a melancholy intelligence, a man disillusioned by one system and cautiously optimistic about another. He was, in essence, the perfect mirror for the disaffected. And for Directorate K, the KGB's counterintelligence and infiltration arm, he was a meticulously trained illegal agent, planted in the United States without diplomatic cover, tasked with a long-term operation of profound significance. His mission was not to steal battlefield plans, but to acquire the very technology that underpinned American military and economic dominance. The meeting between Eleanor and Dmitry was engineered to feel like serendipity. It occurred on a rainy Tuesday evening in November 1976, at a panel discussion on Soviet economic policy after Khrushchev, hosted by the Kennan Institute. Eleanor attended out of professional curiosity. Dmitry attended because his handler had identified Eleanor from a list of OEA employees with mid-level clearance. During the tepid question and answer session, Eleanor posed a hesitant technical question about export controls on agricultural technology. She fumbled her words, intimidated by the panel of academics. After the event, as attendees dispersed, Dmitry approached her. He didn't offer praise, he offered understanding. "Your question was the most relevant one asked tonight," he said, his English precise but accented. "The academics, they speak of theory, you spoke of practice. It is the machine tools and the computers that define the real economy, not the 5-year plans." Eleanor, unused to such direct validation, was immediately intrigued. He introduced himself as Dmitri, a fellow student of the bureaucratic state. They spoke for nearly an hour. He listened intently as she described the frustrations of her job, the feeling of being a gatekeeper without any real authority. He mirrored her frustrations, comparing the American bureaucracy to the Soviet nomenklatura, finding common ground in their shared annoyance with arbitrary rules. Their courtship was a study in psychological grooming. Dmitri did not overwhelm her with romance. Instead, he offered intellectual companionship. They met for coffee, visited museums, and took long walks. He spoke of his disillusionment with the Soviet system, a narrative that resonated with the post-Watergate cynicism prevalent in Washington. He positioned himself as a man without a country, seeking stability. To Eleanor, Dmitri was an escape from her beige existence. He was worldly, complex, and, most importantly, he found her interesting. He valued her insights into the very system that overlooked her. In the spring of 1977, Dmitri proposed marriage. His reasoning was pragmatic, almost unromantic, which made it feel all the more genuine. He explained that his refugee status was precarious. Marriage to an American citizen would grant him a green card, security, and the stability he needed to build a new life. For Eleanor, it offered a different kind of security, an end to her loneliness and a partnership with a man she believed to be her intellectual equal. They were married in a simple civil ceremony at the Arlington County Courthouse in May 1977. The FBI conducted a routine background check, as was standard for any government employee marrying a foreign national from a denied area. The check came back clean. Dmitri Volkov was exactly who his paperwork said he was, a harmless, slightly melancholic academic. The illegal agent's legend had held. The marriage was registered, and Eleanor Vance became Eleanor Volkov. The operation had officially begun. The first year of their marriage was, by all external measures, placid. They settled into a domestic routine. Dmitri was a supportive spouse. He took an interest in her work, listening patiently as she recounted the minor dramas and bureaucratic hurdles of her day at the Office of Export Administration. This phase was critical. It was the normalization period, designed to build a foundation of absolute trust before any request was made. Dmitri's approach was subtle, aligning with the PGU's doctrine of co-option rather than coercion. He never asked to see classified material. Instead, he engaged her in what seemed like intellectual exercises. "I do not understand this American obsession with controlling everything," he might muse over dinner. "This company, Control Data Corporation, they wish to sell a computer to your allies in Europe. Why does your office review this? Is Germany not a friend?" Eleanor, eager to demonstrate her specialized knowledge to her appreciative husband, would explain, "It's not about Germany, Dmitri. It's about diversion. The system is designed to prevent the technology from being resold to the Eastern Bloc. This particular mainframe, for example, has processing speeds that could be used for strategic calculations. Modeling air defense, for instance." "Ah," Dmitri would say, nodding slowly. "So, you are the one who decides?" "Not me, personally," Eleanor would clarify. "I review the technical application, check it against the commodity control list, and write a summary report for my supervisor. He usually just signs off on my recommendation." This was the opening Dmitri needed. He began to help her. When Eleanor brought home unclassified drafts of her reports, a minor breach of protocol, but common practice for overworked staff, Dmitri would offer to review them. "Your analysis is good, Elena," he would say, using his pet name for her, "but perhaps you are not emphasizing the economic benefit to the American exporter enough. You must frame it in a way your superiors understand." His suggestions were intelligent. They refined her arguments, and her supervisors began to notice. Her reports were sharper, more comprehensive. She received a minor commendation for her thoroughness. Eleanor felt a surge of pride. Her marriage was making her better at her job. The discovery was not a single moment of revelation, but a slow, creeping dawn of complicity. In early 1978, a complex application arrived on her desk. It was from a Swedish subsidiary of a major U.S. electronics firm, requesting a license to export a new generation of microprocessors to a third-party logistics company based in Austria. The case was borderline. The chips had clear dual-use potential, particularly in missile guidance systems. Eleanor was stressed, uncertain which way to recommend. That evening, Dmitri found her agonizing over the file at their dining table. "This is the one causing you trouble?" he asked gently. He looked at the technical specifications, his gaze lingering on the processing speeds and heat tolerances. "This is very advanced," he murmured, "but the end user is listed as a civilian meteorological service in Vienna. Surely that is harmless?" "I'm not sure," Eleanor hedged. "The application is thin on details. Perhaps," Dmitri suggested, "you should bring home the full application package, not just your summary. Let me look at the technical blueprints. My background in economics included industrial systems. I might see something you missed." It was a significant escalation. Bringing home internal summaries was a minor infraction. Bringing home proprietary blueprints and end-user certifications was a serious breach. But she was exhausted, and she trusted him. She brought the file home. Dmitri spread the documents across the table. He was no longer the melancholy academic. He was focused, his eyes scanning the technical data with an intensity she had never seen. He pointed to a diagram. "This part," he said, "this data bus controller, it is the key, but the application obscures its military potential. If you approve this, Alina, you are helping peace. You are showing that America is not afraid to share. It builds trust." He guided her hand, helping her draft the approval recommendation, carefully phrasing the justification to mitigate the dual-use concerns. She submitted it the next day. It was approved. A week later, Dmitri asked her to do it again, for a different file, and again, the week after. Eleanor had discovered that her husband was not just interested in her work, he was directing it. She had discovered that she was no longer just an analyst, she was an asset. The realization was terrifying, but it was also, in a strange, distorted way, exhilarating. She was no longer invisible, she was important. While Eleanor Volkov was being psychologically groomed, a different, colder reality was playing out across the city. The FBI's Washington Field Office, WFO, maintained a constant resource-intensive surveillance operation against the Soviet embassy on 16th Street. This was the main enemy. The operation was methodical, built on patience and the meticulous collection of seemingly trivial data. Agent Ray Jenkins was a product of this environment. He was a 20-year veteran of the Bureau's counterintelligence division, a man who believed the Cold War was a zero-sum game. He was not a creature of the post-Hoover new FBI. He was an old-school spy catcher, distrustful of détente and deeply suspicious of all Soviet nationals on U.S. soil. His current target was a man known as Alexander Grechko, the embassy's third secretary for cultural affairs. The FBI knew cultural affairs was a standard cover for the KGB residency, and they suspected Grechko, whom they codenamed Boris, was a PGU line officer running local assets. For months, the surveillance on Boris had yielded nothing but diplomatic cocktail parties and boring cultural exchanges. Then, in March 1978, the pattern changed. A mobile surveillance unit, a standard sedan with 2 agents, tailed Boris from the embassy to a small park in DuPont Circle. Boris sat on a bench, feeding pigeons for exactly 7 minutes. He then stood, brushed off his coat, and walked away. It was textbook dry cleaning, making sure he wasn't being followed. Minutes later, a second man, unknown to the FBI team, sat on the same bench. The team photographed the man from a distance as he retrieved a small object, possibly a newspaper, left under the bench. The man was nondescript. Dark hair, glasses, carrying a book. The agents logged the encounter as a suspected brush pass or dead drop, but the unknown man's face was partially obscured. The photographs were filed, inconclusive. Separate from this, a routine administrative flag was generated within the FBI's records. A GS-9 employee at the Department of Commerce, Eleanor Vance, had renewed her security clearance. The automated check noted her marriage to a Soviet émigré, Dmitri Volkov. Agent Jenkins, whose responsibilities included reviewing potential penetrations of the export control agencies, saw the file. On paper, it was low risk. Volkov was a vetted refugee. However, Jenkins was methodical. He cross-referenced Volkov's name with other active cases. Nothing. On a hunch, he pulled the grainy surveillance photos from the March DuPont Circle incident. He compared the blurry image of the unknown man with the clear passport-style photo in Dmitry Volkov's immigration file. The build was similar. The hairline matched. The glasses were the same. It was not proof, but it was a strong connection. A clean émigré meeting a suspected KGB officer in a clandestine manner, whose wife just happened to work at the OEA. For Jenkins, this was not a coincidence. It was a developing conspiracy. He immediately requested a Level 4 surveillance package on both Dmitry and Eleanor Volkov. This was not a minor undertaking. It involved physical surveillance teams, financial record audits, and, most significantly, a black bag operation. While the Volkovs were out, an FBI team, operating under a secret FISA warrant, entered their Arlington apartment. They didn't find spy gear. They found something more mundane and just as damning. They placed microphones in the walls and a tap on their telephone line. From that moment, every word spoken in the Volkov apartment was recorded and transcribed. The FBI began listening. They didn't hear discussions of espionage. They heard what sounded like a loving, supportive husband helping his wife with her homework. But the homework he was helping her with was the technical analysis of controlled technology exports. Jenkins now knew. The fake marriage was not just for a green card, it was the entire infiltration vector. The FBI surveillance revealed the insidious nature of the operation. Dmitry never threatened Eleanor. He never paid her. He used the most powerful tools of all, validation and ideology. The tapes from the apartment were chilling in their domesticity. "You see, Alina," Dmitry's voice would be heard, calm and reassuring. "This data on silicon wafer manufacturing, your government holds it back, believing it maintains their advantage. But it only creates tension. It forces my former country to spend its resources on defense rather than on food for its people. By letting this information go to a neutral party, you are not a traitor. You are an agent of peace. You are correcting an imbalance." But Dmitry," Eleanor's hesitant voice would reply, "the export manual says anything over 100 nanometer lithography is critically controlled. This is far beyond that. It is a guideline, not a moral law," he'd counter smoothly. "Your supervisor trusts your judgment. We will write the justification together. We will focus on the civilian application for advanced weather forecasting." The confrontation, when it came, was not between the FBI and the spies. It was between Eleanor and the reality of her actions. As 1978 progressed, Dmitry's requests grew more specific and more urgent. He was no longer interested in random files. He provided her with specific case numbers. He was being tasked by his handler Boris, who was, in turn, being tasked by Moscow Center. The KGB wanted everything related to the new VAX 11780 Super Mini computer and, most urgently, technical data on the nascent industry of fiber optics. Eleanor's internal conflict was tearing her apart. The loneliness that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. She was losing weight. Her colleagues at the OEA noted her increasing nervousness, but attributed it to her workload. The true confrontation was a psychological one, orchestrated by Dmitry. One evening in October, she refused his request. It was for a complete technical manual for a new guidance system component. "I can't, Dmitry," she whispered, her hands shaking. "This isn't about peace. This is different. This is military." Dmitry's demeanor changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, analytical precision. He did not raise his voice. "You can," he said flatly. "And you will. You have been helping me for 10 months, Alina. You have signed your name to dozens of recommendations that I drafted. You have brought classified documents to this apartment. Who do you think they will believe? The dedicated analyst or her manipulative Soviet husband? They will believe me. They will see you as a willing ideologue, or worse, a fool." He paused, letting the weight of her complicity settle on her. "If you stop now, I will be forced to leave. And when I leave, I will make sure they find what you have done. You will lose your job. You will lose your reputation. You will be prosecuted. Or you can continue. We are a team. We are making a difference. This is our work." There was no choice. It was a confrontation she had already lost the moment she brought the first file home. The love she thought she had was revealed as a cage. She was trapped. She retrieved the file for him the next day. The FBI, listening to the entire exchange, knew they had their case. They now had evidence not just of espionage, in progress, but of coercion. With the evidence of coercion and the clear identification of a major technology transfer operation, the FBI's objective shifted. Agent Jenkins's priority was no longer just to build a case, but to turn the asset or shut the network down before irreparable damage was done. The intelligence community was becoming acutely aware that the technology Eleanor was leaking, particularly the microprocessing and guidance data, was directly contributing to the Soviet military's sudden, alarming advances in missile accuracy. The challenge was Dmitry. As an illegal agent, he had no diplomatic immunity. He could be arrested and tried, but Jenkins knew that the moment they moved on him, Dmitry would have an extraction plan. Illegals were trained for this. The exposure had to be handled with surgical precision. The decision was made to approach Eleanor first, to sever the link. On the morning of November 14, 1978, Eleanor Volkov arrived at her desk in the Department of Commerce building. Before she could even remove her coat, her division chief and two men in dark conservative suits she did not recognize approached her. "Mrs. Volkov," one of the men said, flashing his FBI credentials discreetly, "we need you to come with us. There's a matter of national security to discuss." A cold dread settled over her. She was escorted not to a police station, but to a sterile, windowless conference room on a secure floor. Agent Jenkins was waiting for her. There were no bright lights, no shouting. Jenkins's approach was one of profound, analytical disappointment. "Mrs. Volkov," he began, "we are not here to discuss your marriage. We are here to discuss the work of Colonel Viktor Orlov of the KGB's First Chief Directorate." Eleanor stared, her face pale. I don't know who that is. My husband's name is Dmitry." Jenkins slid a folder across the table. It contained grainy black and white surveillance photos. The first was of Dmitry meeting Boris in DuPont Circle. The second was of Dmitry, years earlier, in a Soviet military uniform, taken by an asset in East Berlin. "Dmitry Volkov is a fiction," Jenkins said flatly. "He is a trained intelligence officer. His mission was to marry someone with your access. His mission was you. The exposure was brutal and efficient." Jenkins and the other agents laid out the timeline, presenting her with transcripts of her own conversations from her apartment. They showed her the dates of her recommendations and the corresponding dates of Dmitry's meetings with his handler. They detailed exactly what the technology she had leaked was being used for. "This microprocessor," Jenkins said, pointing to a file, "is now part of the guidance package for the SS-20 missile, currently aimed at every major city in Western Europe." Eleanor's carefully constructed world, her belief that she was promoting peace, her trust in her husband, disintegrated. She saw the full scope of her deception. She had not been a partner. She had been a tool. As Eleanor was being debriefed, a separate FBI team moved on the Arlington apartment. They were too late. The surveillance team watching the building had reported that Dmitry left at 9:15 a.m., carrying a briefcase, and entered the metro. He never emerged. He had used the public transit system's crowded tunnels to execute an escape plan, likely meeting a KGB vehicle at a prearranged location. When the agents entered the apartment, it was almost empty. Dmitry Volkov had vanished. All his clothes, books, and personal effects were gone. The only things left were Eleanor's belongings. On the dining room table, where they had drafted the treasonous reports together, was a single, small item, Eleanor's wedding ring. He hadn't even taken it with him. The fake marriage was officially dissolved. Eleanor Volkov's interrogation, or debriefing, as the Bureau preferred to call it, lasted for 72 hours in the secure facility. It was not a punitive process. It was a damage assessment. Jenkins and a specialist from the CIA's counter-espionage group needed to know everything Viktor Orlov had seen, touched, or expressed interest in. They used a non-adversarial technique, leveraging her shock and sense of betrayal. She was a victim as much as a perpetrator, and they presented themselves as her only way out. "Eleanor," Jenkins would say, his voice measured, "we know he manipulated you. We heard the tapes. But right now, men and women in uniform are at risk because of the technology he acquired. You are the only person who can help us understand what they know." Eleanor, numb and exhausted, cooperated fully. She recounted every conversation, every file, every technical question Dmitry had ever asked. She described his specific fascination with fiber optics, his questions about lithography techniques, and his interest in the logistics of shipping companies used by defense contractors. As she spoke, the intelligence analysts in the room grew increasingly grim. Orlov had not been a simple document thief. He had been a technical collector of the highest order, using his wife's access to build a complete strategic picture of American high-technology export vulnerabilities. He hadn't just stolen secrets, he had stolen the processes themselves. The institutional response was immediate and cloaked in secrecy. A public trial was out of the question. Prosecuting Eleanor Volkov would mean revealing in open court the exact security weaknesses of the OEA and the specific technologies that had been compromised. It would inform the KGB of what the FBI knew and how they knew it, the apartment microphones. It would be a catastrophic breach of methods and sources. Eleanor was presented with a stark choice, delivered by a somber official from the Department of Justice. She could face a sealed indictment for conspiracy to commit espionage, which would undoubtedly lead to a long prison sentence, or she could cease to exist. The second option involved her pleading guilty to lesser, non-public charges of mishandling government documents, resigning immediately, and entering a form of unofficial, internal witness protection. She would be given a new name, a new identity, and relocated. She would have to sever all ties with her past, her family, and her former life. She would be monitored, discreetly, for the rest of her life. She chose the latter. The system, in its cold, pragmatic way, had decided. Eleanor Vance, the GS9 analyst, was a problem to be managed. The threat she posed was one of embarrassment and exposure. The institution's response was not to seek justice, but to contain the damage and erase the error. Eleanor Volkov signed the papers, her identity vanishing with the stroke of a pen. The immediate political and institutional consequences of the Vance-Volkov case were profound, yet almost entirely invisible to the public. Within the intelligence community, it was a seismic event. It confirmed that the KGB's illegals program was not a Cold War relic, but a sophisticated, active, and dangerous threat. The Office of Export Administration was quietly and ruthlessly overhauled. Eleanor's supervisor was demoted and transferred to a non-sensitive post in Alaska. Security protocols were rewritten. The Vance Protocol, as it became known internally, was implemented. Any government employee with access to dual-use technology lists who had a spouse or close relative from a denied area was now subject to mandatory continuous background checks and polygraph examinations. The era of trusting a clean defector file was over. For Agent Ray Jenkins, the case was a bitter victory. He received a quiet commendation for contributions to national security, but he knew the main target had escaped. Colonel Viktor Orlov was back in Moscow, likely being decorated as a hero of the Soviet Union. Jenkins had closed a case, but he felt he had lost the engagement. He became even more driven, his suspicion of détente hardening into certainty that the Soviets viewed it as nothing more than a new, more subtle battlefield. The personal aftermath for Eleanor was a study in absolute erasure. She became Helen Price, a woman with a fabricated past, moved to a quiet suburb outside of Portland, Oregon. The government found her a clerical job at a local utility company. Her life, which had once been defined by loneliness, was now defined by complete isolation. She was haunted by the consequences of her actions. She had not sought to harm her country. She had merely sought to be seen. The cost of that desire was her entire identity. She lived in constant low-level fear. She assumed her neighbors were informants, that her phone was tapped, that every new acquaintance was a test. The psychological manipulation Dmitry had subjected her to was replaced by the cold, impersonal surveillance of her own government, her protectors. The fake marriage had resulted in a real, if unacknowledged, casualty. Eleanor had lost her name, her career, and her belief in her own judgment. She was a ghost in her own life, the living embodiment of a counterintelligence damage control operation. The tragedy was not that her marriage was a lie, but that the lie had become her only truth. Years passed. The Cold War thawed, froze again, and then collapsed with the shocking speed of a failing dam. In 1992, the world was a different place. The Soviet Union was no more. Agent Ray Jenkins, now retired from the FBI, was living in Florida, sorting through his unclassified memoirs. The fall of the USSR had led to a brief, chaotic period of cooperation between Russian and American intelligence services. Files that had been locked in the archives of Lubyanka and Yasenevo were selectively released. Jenkins, through old contacts, received a copy of a file related to his old case. It was the KGB operational file for Operation Ether, the code name for the infiltration of the OEA. Reading the translated Russian documents, Jenkins finally saw the operation from the other side. It was colder and more calculating than he could have imagined. The file contained the initial surveillance photos of Eleanor Vance, psychological profiles, and even transcripts of her conversations before Dmitry had ever met her, sourced from a different unknown asset within the Commerce Department. The file detailed the success of the mission. The technical data Orlov Dmitry had acquired had been fast-tracked to Soviet design bureaus, OKBs. The intelligence was credited with saving the Soviet military-industrial complex an estimated 5 to 7 years of research and development in inertial guidance and microprocessor manufacturing. The SS-20 missiles' accuracy improvements in the early 1980s, which had so terrified NATO, were directly linked to the files Eleanor Vance had passed to her husband. And then there was the file on Colonel Viktor Orlov. He had indeed been awarded the Order of the Red Banner. He was not, however, a businessman in the new Russia. According to a final entry from 1988, Orlov had been removed from his post for operational recklessness and ideological deviation. Jenkins interpreted the vague language. Orlov, the master manipulator, had perhaps started to believe his own Western cover story, or had simply become a liability. His fate was unknown, likely ending in a quiet reassignment or an unmarked grave. The system he served had consumed him, just as it had consumed Eleanor. In Portland, Oregon, Helen Price read a newspaper article about the technological gap that had bankrupted the Soviet Union. The article mentioned that the Soviets had been surprisingly adept at mimicking Western microchip designs in the 1980s, though they could never match the scale of production. Helen folded the paper, her expression unchanging. She went to her job at the library where she now worked, meticulously cataloging books. She was a model employee, quiet, efficient, and invisible. The Vance-Volkov operation provides a stark case study in the true nature of Cold War espionage. It was a conflict that transcended the ideological struggle of capitalism versus communism, focusing instead on the pragmatic acquisition of systems. The ultimate prize was not territory, but technology. The KGB's masterstroke was realizing that the keys to the kingdom were not held by generals, but by mid-level overlooked clerks like Eleanor Vance. The operation's success was not built on high-stakes action or physical intimidation. It was a soft infiltration, weaponizing human vulnerability. Eleanor's loneliness and her desire for significance were more effective tools for recruitment than money or blackmail. Dmitry did not force her. He enabled her, reframing her betrayal as a moral and intellectual act of peace. The fake marriage was the perfect cover, a psychological cocoon that insulated the asset from her own conscience. This case highlights the profound moral ambiguity at the heart of the intelligence war. Was Eleanor a traitor? Yes, by any legal definition. Was she a victim? Undeniably. Her agency was systematically dismantled by a state-sponsored psychological operation. Was Viktor Orlov an enemy? Yes, but he was also a professional, executing his mission with textbook precision, only to be discarded by his own masters when his utility expired. Agent Jenkins, too, operated in a gray zone. To protect the state, he participated in the necessary, cold-blooded erasure of a citizen's life. The system, on both sides, demanded the sacrifice of the individual for the perceived security of the whole. Ultimately, the infiltration of the OEA was a reminder that the most significant battles of the Cold War were not fought over missile silos, but over technical manuals, export licenses, and the human heart. The fake marriage was a strategic weapon, demonstrating that the most secure defense systems could be bypassed by exploiting the simple, desperate human need to be valued. The legacy of the case is not one of spies and gadgets, but a quiet, enduring tragedy of misplaced trust.